Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for welcoming me into your community today. And in particular, I'd like to thank Reverend Stephen Milton and Judy Pressman for the invitation and support. Before I begin my scripted talk, I just want to say how much I appreciate the topic and the subject matter that you've been sharing this morning, Stephen, about this Holy Trinity and this idea of love. Some of the concepts that I'll share in my talk this morning are things like decriminalization and safer supply and harm reduction. Often get tied up into perceptions of what those things mean and a very political idea, but really all of those things are rooted in love, as I hope you'll take away from what I share today. I'd also like to just take a moment to situate myself and my family in the context of my talk today. It's important for me to name the fact that when it comes to our various forms of substance use, when it comes to our interactions with the law and with healthcare systems, my family benefits from a significant amount of privilege by virtue of our whiteness, our gender identities and sexual orientations, and our socioeconomic status, to name just a few factors. I'm acutely aware of the reasons why my loved one does not experience the same level of surveillance, oppression, and violence as members of Black, Indigenous, racialized, queer, and poor communities. And the next slide, please, Judy. So I'd like to share a story with you this morning, and it's important for me to start by letting you know that everything I'm about to share with you, I share with the permission of my brother. The slide says AC's story, and those are photos of our tattoos. But the version that I'll share with you here is really our story because no version I present will ever truly be his. And so my brother is smart. He's creative. He's hilarious. He's charismatic and handsome. Growing up, we were children of divorce at a time when we were the only kids in our class with divorced parents. And we survived many traumas in our childhood, but we've always had each other. And so substance use for us started in high school. We drank heavily and used cannabis mostly. And we did not talk about drugs in our family. And then my brother had his first episode of mania and psychosis in the days leading up to his 19th birthday. And I think I'd heard of bipolar disorder, but I didn't really know what it meant when the doctor started talking about a diagnosis. And it's been a challenging nearly 20 years since then. He's had major episodes every 6 to 18 months, which always include interactions with the law, lengthy hospitalizations, and dramatic changes in his substance use. I've watched my brother's life be decimated, and then I've walked with him as he slowly rebuilds it over and over again. And in this time, he's seen and been treated by as many doctors as it's been years, maybe more, which is significant when we think about the impacts of connections between people's substance use and family. In our case, the only consistency of care that my brother has ever truly known is me and our mom. We've borne witness to his journey and the ways in which mental illness and chaotic substance use have impacted him, but rarely are we respected or invited into his circle of care by professionals. It's always confused me how my brother's long history of mental illness and substance use is never easily shared by these professionals, but what is always passed along are the labels. And if anyone's ever worked in the healthcare sector, particularly in a hospital emergency room, perhaps you'll recognize these terms, like frequent flyer, and drug-seeking behavior. The onset of my brother's illness brought his post-secondary studies to a halt. And eventually, he started working in the only industry where he felt comfortable and capable, and that was bartending and serving. He'd get a job, and he would be so good at it. Remember, smart, funny, charismatic, handsome. But eventually, that culture within that industry would overwhelm him again. And so in the early years, after the onset of his illness, when he was struggling to manage the psychosis, the mania, depression, and drug use, I'd drop everything to fly or drive to wherever he was. Because in the early years, that was my main concern. I wanted him to know that he wasn't alone and that he knew he's loved. But then things started to shift as he got a bit older. And it had to when he drank even more and used more drugs, just not the ones that the doctors wanted him to use. And he hurt people, not just himself. And suddenly the patience and compassion previously shown to him by police, doctors, nurses, social workers, not to mention his friends and our own family, started to get very, very thin. And so soon I would drop everything to make sure the police took him to the hospital instead of jail. I can't count how many times I had to beg and plead and convince people, law and health professionals alike, that he's not just a jerk, although he sure can be when he's in the midst of a manic episode. But he's really struggling. He has an illness. It just doesn't show up on his skin or in an X-ray. And yes, he uses illegal drugs. And at a certain point, I realized that I wasn't just my brother's caregiver. I also had to be his advocate. The only problem was no one showed me or him how to advocate effectively. No one would tell us how these systems work or how we need to work these systems. So when we talk about the stigma of mental illness and drug use, it can sometimes be difficult for people to conceptualize what it looks like if they've never experienced it. It looks like having to hide yourself from the world. It looks like losing your job and your apartment and so many relationships and being judged and turned away when you look for new ones. And the internalized stigma that people who use illegal drugs live with is so painful. Of course it is, when the way you're trying to survive is criminalized, when you have to hide it and feel shame and are treated like less than human. And so each day I carry a fear that sits on my heart like a boulder. I live in fear of the next call. Will it be the hospital? Will it be the police? Or will it be the coroner? The next slide, please, Chivy. So why do I share this story with you here today? I'm here as a family member of someone who continues to be impacted by the criminalization of certain substances and of mental illness, and as a representative of Mom Stop the Harm. As members of Mom Stop the Harm, we share our stories because we found that by sharing our pain, we're able to open people's hearts. And when we open people's hearts, we can open their minds. Next slide, please. So a little bit more about who we are at Mom Stop the Harm. We are a network of families across the country impacted by substance use-related harms and deaths. And we are working together to harness our grief into advocacy while also caring for each other through peer support and finding opportunities to share our learning and knowledge. Here on the screen are the 3 founding members. So at top left is Petra Schultz, and she's holding a picture of her son, Danny. Next to Petra is Leslie McBain, and she's holding a picture of her son, Jordan. And below them is Lorna Thomas, holding a picture of her son, Alex. Danny, Jordan, and Alex all died of a substance-related death. Petra, Leslie, and Lorna came together in their grief and made a commitment to turn it into action to stop the deaths and harms caused by the failed war on drugs. The first Moms meeting was held in October of 2016 with 15 attendees. We are now more than 3,000 members nationwide. Next slide, please. So what are we calling for? The people most affected by drug policy and the experts who actually work in drug policy are calling for action in 5 key domains. A safe, regulated supply of prescribed substances for those who need them, so people don't have to turn to toxic street drugs. Decriminalization of drug possession for personal use, so we can help people instead of locking them up. Harm reduction services for anyone at risk, so everyone stays as healthy as possible. Evidence-based treatment when and where people need it, so nobody dies waiting. And upstream prevention by addressing mental health, trauma, and other risk factors, so people don't need to turn to drugs. We must end stigma, shame, and blame for so-called bad individual choices. By doing so, we will allow people to seek the help they don't only need, but deserve. Next slide, please. So we also support moving to the legal regulation of all substances, like we've seen with alcohol and cannabis, to allow people to use and enjoy their substances of choice more safely. It's important to note that support for legal regulation is just that. It's not about commercialization. We want to see a public health approach taken based on benefits and harms through models that can range from prescribing, specialized government stores, pharmacy, and other over-the-counter retail. And the aim of regulation is to protect children and youth and to allow adults to make adult decisions. I've shared a quote here from fellow drug activist David Poses, the late David Poses, I'm afraid I have to say, because he too succumbed to this crisis of toxic drugs only a few months ago. And David always said, alcohol isn't legal because it's safer. It's safer because it's legal. We find ourselves in the midst of a national public health emergency of overdose and toxic drug deaths, and its origins are in the failed war on drugs, which is in fact a war on the people we love. What's known as the iron law of prohibition tells us that as law enforcement becomes more intense, the potency of prohibited substances increases. The harder the enforcement, the harder the drugs. Think moonshine in the 1920s Prohibition era. Prohibition killed then, and it's killing our loved ones now. Next slide, please. So these are the 3 pillars of what we do at Moms Stop the Harm. Educate through the sharing of our stories and lived expertise, like I'm doing right now. Advocate through a variety of campaigns and actions that we're continuously engaged in, including our recent push to try to get MPs to send private members Bill C-216 to the Standing Committee on Health which I'm sorry to say we were unsuccessful in. And support, which we do through the facilitation of peer support groups in communities across the country. So in my community of Northumberland County, I facilitate both a Holding Hope group, which is for those who are impacted by a loved one's substance use, and I facilitate a bereavement circle called Healing Hearts, which is for those of us who have lost someone we love to a drug or substance use related death. Next slide, please. We're also taking more radical action. While our name may conjure up certain ideas of who we are at Mom Stop the Harm, Petra Schultz likes to say these days, no more Miss Nice Mom. We are standing in solidarity with people who use illegal drugs and finding ways to support drug user unions and compassion clubs as they continue to do the work to save their own lives. Next slide, please. Grief expert David Kessler says that judgment demands punishment. And to me, this is exactly why we must decriminalize all drugs, because there is no anti-stigma campaign out there that can help end the stigma and pain experienced by our loved ones who use certain substances while those substances remain illegal. The conversation around problematic substance use has shifted significantly so that more people are acknowledging it to be a health issue, not a criminal issue. But I also want to say that not all substance use is a health issue either. For many people who use illicit substances, it's not an issue at all. Except for the fact that prohibition and criminalization have made it a health issue for everyone because of how they have led to the growing toxicity of today's drug supply. Judgment demands punishment. We do not judge and punish people with other health conditions that can be tied to their habits or activities or behaviors. It's time to stop judging and punishing people who use certain substances. We engage in this work to contribute to and build upon the work, advocacy, activism, and experience of those who have been in this work much longer than us. This includes drug user activists and unions, other family groups, and particularly Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities who continue to be disproportionately impacted by the failed war on drugs. Next slide, please. So Petra always ends her presentations with a slide that reads, "I'm so glad you're here." And I've adopted it too because I am so glad you're here. If you are someone who is being impacted by the criminalization of your drug use and the toxic drug supply, I'm so glad you're still here with us. And if you're someone who wants to learn more and are willing to listen and engage, I'm really glad you're here too. Thank you.